The city of Mobile, Alabama wore its history like damp cloth, heavy, humid, and impossible to shake. In the years before the Civil War, the town sprawled along the slow brown sweep of the Alabama River, its wharves stacked with cotton bales, its air thick with river mud and ambition. In those days, nearly half the city's swelling population lived in bondage. Their unacknowledged labor, the invisible engine behind every polished balcony, every gleaming carriage wheel, every ledger swollen with profit, elegant houses rose, like marble illusions along Government and Dauphin streets, their wrought iron balconies catching the glimmer of lantern light each evening. Merchants argued beneath their awnings, lawyers hurried in dust-colored coats, and ladies in hooped skirts drifted from shop to shop, while enslaved attendants followed 2 paces behind, carrying parcels. Yet beneath all of Mobile's refined bustle, there was something else. Something that smelled of fear and swamp heat, and the slow decay of secrets left too long in the sun. Among the people who moved quietly through that world was Solomon, a man purchased in the winter of 1843 from an estate in Charleston and brought without ceremony, without family, without even his own past intact to the imposing DeVio house on Key Street. He arrived as winter winds scraped the harbor and the sky hung low with gray clouds that promised rain but never delivered it. Pierre DeVoe, cotton factor and self-satisfied benefactor of half the wealthy planters in Baldwin County, had bought him not out of necessity, but curiosity. The bill of sale described Solomon in a detached clerk's hand, age 31, tall, literate, skilled in medicine, skilled in carpentry, docile temperament. Pierre had liked that last line. It confirmed his belief that he was a man who understood human nature, even when the humans in question were legally his property. But the word docile had been scratched into too many ledgers by too many men who had not looked closely enough. Solomon was tall and spare, his face angular and quiet, the kind of face that seemed carved for observation rather than expression. His hands bore thin white scars from old carpentry cuts, and when he walked, his steps never announced him. It was not that he tried to be silent, it was that he moved like someone accustomed to watching the room before the room watched him. He was given quarters behind the mansion, in a row of narrow wooden rooms that backed against an alley where the air always carried the mingled smells of laundry water, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of crushed jasmine. The other enslaved people learned only that he had once belonged to a Quaker physician who had taught him to read medical texts. At first, this news merely made them wary. Literacy in their world could be a dangerous double-edged thing. But what unsettled them more was the way Solomon listened slowly, attentively, as if every word, no matter how trivial, had weight. The DeVio household itself ran in the polished, unyielding rhythm of wealth. Marguerite DeVio, with her New Orleans breeding and her sharp eye for anything out of place, commanded her servants with a mixture of impatience and icy expectation. She prided herself on a home where silver-polished daily reflected like shallow water and floors gleamed like mirrors. In this world, Solomon's role was initially simple: maintenance, errands, the occasional mixing of a tonic or poultice when the doctor was absent or too drunk to be found. Mobile's physicians were notorious for their habits, and families relied heavily on enslaved healers to manage fevers, wounds, and the endless bouts of illness that crept through the humid summers. Pierre, believing himself progressive, allowed Solomon to borrow books from his library, medicinal compendiums, illustrated anatomy texts, botanical references from Europe. The idea that a slave might be quietly absorbing knowledge he had no right to possess did not trouble Pierre. In fact, he felt enlarged by the gesture, proud of his own generosity. He never imagined what Solomon did with those books when the candles burned low and the household slept mobile. For all its elegance was a city built on proximity, house close, gossip closer, and the enslaved community moving silently between them, carrying packets, messages, food, whispered scandals. Through this web of movement, Solomon learned more than anyone suspected. While Rachel stirred pots in the kitchen, while Eliza scrubbed floors that would never stay clean more than a few hours, while Marcus maneuvered the carriage along the same streets day after day, Solomon listened, learned, observed. He learned that Thomas Chamberlain, the mill owner, climbed stairs with difficulty and often paused halfway up, leaning on the railing while his face mottled red. He learned that Catherine Apprentice ate little because her brother humiliated her at every meal, that Robert Apprentice drank himself insensible at gambling dens, and that in his rages he struck not only his slaves, but his own sister, that Mrs. Talbot older than most women who still attended social luncheons had begun forgetting whether she'd closed her windows at night. He learned everything, and while others saw these details as the scattered pieces of daily life, Solomon saw something different. He saw patterns, vulnerabilities, the keystones of lives that looked strong but were built on brittle foundations. At first, he only watched. But watching, for a certain kind of mind, can become a form of temptation. He gathered plants on Aaron's white snake root in the shaded dips of the riverbank. Foxglove, where the soil was rich and damp, oleander clipped discreetly from ornamental hedges, aconite bulbs purchased under the guise of pest control. He dried the leaves in his quarters, ground them to powder, tested their scents and textures. No one questioned him. A slave preparing remedies was nothing unusual. Many planters encouraged such knowledge, eager to avoid doctors' fees. But Solomon was not learning to heal, and by the time Mobile's air thickened into the early heat of April 1847, when frogs screamed in the marshes and the nights felt swollen with the promise of yellow fever, Solomon had chosen his first target. The first death, when it came, slid so neatly into the rhythms of life in Mobile that no one felt the shape of the danger behind it. On the evening of April 23, 1847, Thomas Chamberlain collapsed alone in his study, the air around him still scented with tobacco and varnish. He had eaten heavily that night, pork potatoes, a brandy poured generously, as he liked it, and afterward had retreated to his books, muttering to his wife that the heat made his chest feel tight. When Abigail found him an hour later, his head was buried in the carpet fibers, his fingers stiffening into claws. His lips had gone blue, and his enormous frame still, dressed in the fine waistcoat he favored, looked strangely shrunken. Dr. Wickham came as quickly as a man of his habits could manage, half tipsy, but competent enough to proclaim, after a brief inspection, that the heart had simply given out. A man of hearty appetite, heavy lungs, and too much comfort, he said. It was bound to happen. But 3 days earlier, in the kitchen hallway, Mary the Chamberlain's cook had heard Solomon murmur something she had not forgotten. He had arrived to deliver a message from Pierre, and when Thomas had passed him red-faced and panting, Solomon had watched him with the stillness of a man memorizing a portrait. "That man won't last the week," he had said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. Mary had laughed, because the alternative was fear. Mr. Chamberlain, strong as an ox. But Solomon had shaken his head. 3 days, maybe 4. His fingers are swelling. His neck pulses too hard. His heart's trying to carry more than it can. When Mary learned of Thomas Chamberlain's death precisely 3 days later, she told herself it was a coincidence, a strange quirk, a guess made by an observant man. But something in her stomach felt cold. Something that stayed with her long after she washed the bloodstains from Chamberlain's carpet. The second death arrived with the wet heat of June. By then, the air in Mobile had grown thick enough to feel like breath on the back of the neck. Mosquitoes hatched in puddles that never dried, and families with money planned their flight inland before the fever season reached its peak. Catherine Apprentice never made that journey. Her illness began on a Wednesday, cramps twisting her stomach, perspiration gathering in her hairline, her lips going dry as parchment. By Thursday she was vomiting, so violently she could no longer speak coherent sentences. On Friday, her fever climbed until she began whispering to people who were no longer alive. By dawn on Saturday she lay gray as stone, her body withered by dehydration, her eyes half open but seeing nothing. Dr. Wickham called it possible cholera, possible spoiled food. These things take the frail ones first, he said. And Catherine had always been the frail one. But 2 weeks before her death, Solomon had stood in the apprentice hallway while Robert Apprentice shouted insults at his sister, calling her useless, a burden, ungrateful. Catherine, trembling, had slipped past Solomon with the air of a woman accustomed to quiet misery. When Solomon returned that night, he had told Eliza, in a voice almost indifferent, "She won't survive the summer. Sad women starve from the inside. It weakens the body, makes it catch sickness fast. 2 weeks, maybe 3, and she'll take ill, and she won't recover." Eliza had brushed it off as talk. Talk was safe. Acknowledgement was not. But when Catherine died within the window, Solomon named. The memory of his words returned to her like a secret bruise. Over the next months, the pattern continued like a hidden rhythm in the city's hum. William Foster, clerk at the Cotton Exchange, drowned himself in drink and then in the bay. Solomon had said, just a week before, "A man who drinks near water walks a thin line." Mrs. Talbert, 76, and weary of living, passed peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks after Solomon told Rachel that the old woman's heart beat like tired wings. 5 predictions, 5 deaths, all natural, all expected, all precisely timed. And then autumn came, crisp at the edges, and the deaths began to multiply, while the whispers grew sharper, in kitchens, at wells, in narrow yards, behind great houses. Enslaved people began to talk not loudly, not directly, but in the sideways way of people who know danger has ears. "Solomon sees things," one said. "My grandmother had the sight," said another. But Marcus, who watched more than he spoke, began to see something different. He saw Solomon making himself useful in ways that gave him access where others had none. He saw the herbs drying in Solomon's room. He saw the way Solomon lingered in doorways where medicine was prepared, and he remembered, vividly, the night Solomon returned from delivering a message to Robert Apprentice's hands, smelling faintly, unmistakably, of bitter almonds. It was a scent Marcus had heard about only in frightened whispers, poison, but fear paralyzed the truth. In a world where a slave's testimony weighed less than a gust of wind, what did suspicion matter? If they accused him and were wrong, they could be whipped, sold, or worse. If they accused him and were right, the danger was even greater. So they watched, and waited, and tried, in quiet, shivering hope, to keep their heads down long enough for the storm to pass. The storm did not pass, it grew. The death that arrived in November made the pattern harder to ignore, even for those who wished desperately not to see it. Henry Laurent, Pierre Davau's business partner and closest confidant, died in only 3 days. He was a man of imposing stature and easy laughter, known for his fondness for cigars and his habit of telling the same jokes twice. Though not young, he was robust, too robust, people said afterward, to have withered so quickly. His lungs filled with fluid, his breath rattled, and by the time Dr. Wickham arrived, Laurent could no longer swallow water. Wickham, with a frown that deepened with each passing hour, muttered something about virulent pneumonia, some fierce, fast-moving strain. Pierre accepted the explanation because he needed to be, 'cause the alternative, unspoken and terrible, felt like an accusation aimed at himself. But 2 weeks earlier, Solomon had said something that Pierre could no longer forget. "Mr. Laurent looks poorly these days," he'd remarked casually while polishing silver. "Might want to settle his affairs soon." At the time, Pierre had scolded him for speaking out of turn. A servant should know when to hold his tongue. He had said it reflexively, as a man bothered by impropriety, not danger. But when Laurent died precisely, in the window Solomon had implied, the words returned. like a specter behind his shoulder. What Pierre did not know was that Solomon had been in Laurent's home repeatedly in the weeks before the illness, delivering papers and messages. Each time Laurent offered him coffee or water, hospitality demanded at hand. Each time Solomon had assisted in pouring or preparing the drink. Laurent had remarked twice that his coffee tasted bitter. Jacob, Laurent's enslaved servant, later confessed that he'd been uneasy, but fear had closed his mouth. The seventh death followed quickly, and it cracked something in the city's collective composure. 7-year-old Sarah Whitfield, delicate as spun sugar, had always been a child who seemed borrowed from the world, as though life held her by a thread. But children who linger near death all their lives often hold on stubbornly, confusing doctors by living far longer than they should. Solomon, however, had walked through the Davao kitchen one afternoon in December and said to Mark, in that low, unbothered tone of his, "The Whitfield girl won't see spring." Marguerite flinched, as if struck. "How dare you say such a thing? She's a child with lungs that won't bear another fever," Solomon answered. "Bodies speak clearly, if you listen." 2 months later, little Sarah Whitfield coughed herself into exhaustion and slipped away, while her mother held her hand and begged God not to take her last remaining daughter. The doctor spoke gently of pneumonia. Marguerite, when she heard the news, pressed a trembling hand to her throat and whispered, "How could he have known?" The 8th death arrived with a violence that disturbed even those who believed deeply in natural tragedy. Robert, apprentice gambler, brute, and owner of many bruises on many backs, collapsed in an alley just after leaving a gambling house on Water Street. He'd argued with a dealer, stormed into the night, and somewhere between rage and intoxication, his heart stopped. His face, when the watchman found him, was contorted in a grotesque snarl. "A stroke," the doctor said. A man who drank like that didn't need enemies. But Marcus, who had driven Solomon to Apprentice's warehouse the night before, could not forget the almond scent on Solomon's fingers. Nor could he convince himself that Apprentice's death was anything but orchestrated. The timing, the prediction, the access. It aligned too neatly, like beads on a string pulled tight out by spring of the following year. The enslaved population of Mobile had split into 2 incompatible beliefs. Those who feared Solomon as a man touched by unholy knowledge, and those who feared him simply as a man who had learned how to kill invisible. In both cases, fear was the constant dot, and in the White households, unease began to take root in subtle ways. Gentlemen lowered their voices when discussing their affairs in front of servants. Ladies paused before handing decanters or teacups to enslaved domestics. Men who believed themselves rational and unshakable felt their eyes drifting toward the quiet figure who moved through their dining rooms with folded linens and steady hands. But the one who noticed most sharply was Dr. Edmund Wickham. He was not a man of deep intuition, but he was a man of patterns. He'd attended 5 of the deaths in question. He'd listened to idle chatter at gatherings, comments tossed off lightly. The way the wealthy spoke of servants as though discussing furniture, and as the instances accumulated, as the predictions reappeared in recollection, Wickham found himself unable to ignore the constellations, forming between them a servant, predicting death before it occurred, a servant who had been present near every victim shortly before the end, a servant with medical training. Wickham did not accuse, not yet, but he began to watch. At soirees, he lingered near the doorways where Solomon moved. At dinners, he paid attention to where Solomon's hands traveled as he poured wine or served dishes. He watched those eyes calm dark, observing in return. And each time Solomon met his gaze across a room, Wickham felt a faint, prickling sensation on his skin. He realized too late that the man he watched was studying him back. The 9th death sealed the matter. Judge Marcus Finley's stern man, heavy with power, slow to compassion, died of heart failure In May of 1848, he had suffered chest pains for weeks, but his death was sudden. Too sudden, Wickham told himself, especially when he recalled Pierre's mention of Solomon, predicting the judge's demise before his daughter's wedding. When the funeral passed and the town settled into the normal rituals of mourning, Pierre finally confronted Solomon in his study. The memory of the conversation would haunt him long after. "How did you know Judge Finley would die?" Pierre demanded, his voice taut. "I observed," Solomon replied, his tone respectful but devoid of fear. "You're no physician." "No, sir. But I was taught well. A failing heart has its signs." Pierre felt something cold move beneath his ribs. "Are you making these deaths happen?" Solomon lowered his gaze, but his voice held the faintest thread of amusement. "I serve your household, sir. I cannot make anything happen." But the answer was too calm, too tidy, too polished. It felt like a veil pulled artfully over the truth. Pierre, uneasy, took the matter to Dr. Wickham that same night. And for the first time, the two men laid out the full pattern, the predictions, the proximity, the repeated coincidences that no longer felt like coincidence. 9 deaths, 9 predictions, 9 alignments of opportunity, motive, and timing. They decided to observe Solomon carefully, to gather undeniable proof. Neither man realized that Solomon had already guessed their suspicions and had already planned for them. By the time summer bled slowly into June, the DeVoe household felt like a drum pulled too tight, vibrating with tension at the slightest touch. Marguerite moved through her days with restless hands, polishing things that did not need polishing, checking the locks on cabinets, glancing at Solomon as though he were a long shadow that had learned to walk upright. Pierre attempted to appear composed, but at night he woke gasping from dreams in which his heart clenched like a fist, and no doctor could find the cause. The enslaved quarters behind the house felt the tension. Worst of all, nothing in their lives belonged to them, not their time, not their bodies, not even their fears, but fear itself obeyed no boundaries. It seeped into sleep, into conversations murmured over washbasins, into the silence that settled whenever Solomon walked past, and Solomon himself. He worked quietly, methodically, as if he were the only one unaffected by the storm he'd stirred. Yet even he had changed. His movements were a fraction slower, his gaze just a beat longer on each face, as though he were memorizing them, or deciding something about them. At last, Rachel could no longer hold the weight of what lingered unsaid. One night, long after the household had gone to sleep and the cicadas screamed into the heat, she found Solomon in his room grinding leaves into powder, the pestle whispering rhythmically against stone. "You need to stop," she whispered, her voice small. "Whatever it is you're doing, they're watching you. They're afraid, and when white folks get afraid..." She didn't finish. The implication hung sharp and dangerous. Solomon did not look up. "I don't know what you think I'm doing." "Yes, you do," Marcus said from the doorway, stepping inside with a heaviness in his expression. "We all do. Maybe we don't speak on it, but we know. Them deaths didn't just come. You brought them." The scraping of the pestles slowed. Then Solomon raised his eyes, and for a moment the room felt too narrow, too warm, too close. "You think you understand what I've done," he said softly, "but you don't know what it is to watch people who own you behave like gods. To watch them hurt and destroy and laugh while doing it. To see them take from you every choice a man should have, except what you choose to do in your mind." "So you killed them?" Rachel asked. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to stand firm. "You just decided who deserved to die." "I decided," Solomon replied, "that since they made me into a tool, I would choose how I was used. Since they gave me knowledge, I would choose how I applied it. They believed themselves untouchable, but they were careless. Careless with their cruelty, careless with their secrets." Marcus stepped closer, fear sharpening his voice. "That still ain't your right. You're bringing danger on all of us." Solomon's expression softened, though it remained terribly calm. Marcus, we live every day on the edge of danger. One broken plate, one wrong word, one man's bad temper, and everything can change. At least what I do has purpose. You're going to get caught, Eliza whispered, and when you do, they'll blame all of us. Solomon gave a faint smile, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Marcus's neck rise. Then it's fortunate I have one final act to play. The 10th death happened only 2 weeks later. Swift and merciless. Dr. Edmund Wickham, who had spent months circling the truth like a wary hunter, awoke one morning dizzy and nauseated. At first he blamed cheap whiskey, but by afternoon he could not rise from bed. His stomach seized in violent spasms, and his sweat carried a sour, acrid smell. By the next day, he could no longer form full sentences. His wife, frantic, summoned another physician, a man from Montgomery, who examined Wickham's bloated, darkening face and recognized the signs. Acute renal failure, possibly arsenic poisoning, but Wickham had no enemies. No one with reason to kill him. No one except on the last coherent morning of his life. Wickham clutched at the Montgomery doctor's sleeve and whispered through dry, cracking lips, "Solomon, DeVoe's slave. Poisoner, check." The words were written off as delirium, the dying rattle of a man overcome by fever and toxins. But the Montgomery doctor noted them anyway, puzzled, uneasy. When Wickham died that afternoon, news reached the DeVoe household before sunset. Pierre felt the blood drain from his face. Marguerite dropped her teacup, porcelain shattering like brittle ice, and soon, too soon, a memory returned. Solomon had said casually weeks earlier, "The doctor's kidneys are failing. All that drinking is catching up to him. He won't see summer." A prediction, a certainty, another death fulfilled exactly on time. That evening, the walls of Mobile's polite society cracked open. Panic threaded itself through the parlors and smoking rooms. What had seemed eerie coincidence now felt like a noose tightening around them all. Pierre went directly to Sheriff James Cartwright, a man known for his practicality, his skepticism, and his refusal to be swayed by hysteria. And yet, as the story came pouring out, 10 deaths, 10 predictions, 10 eerie alignments, Cartwright felt gooseflesh crawl along his arms. "You're telling me your slave murdered 10 people?" Cartwright said slowly, "And you're only now coming to me." "I didn't know," Pierre insisted. "None of us saw it until now." Cartwright narrowed his eyes. "Patterns ain't proof. I need something real. Witnesses poison in his possession. Something I can show a judge." "Wickham suspected him." "And Wickham is dead," Cartwright countered, "which only makes this whole thing look worse." Still, he agreed they had enough to justify a search. That night, under a bruised purple sky, Cartwright, Pierre, and 2 deputies approached Solomon's quarters, lanterns glowing like wary eyes. They burst inside. Solomon sat on his narrow bed, fully dressed, as though he'd been expecting them. He did not stand. He did not protest. He folded his hands in his lap and watched them with the calm of a man observing a storm from behind glass. When they tore up the floorboards, the lantern light struck rows of jars, dried herbs, powdered roots, chemical compounds wrapped in neat paper packets, deadly plants arranged with the precision of a scholar's collection. And then they found the ledger. Neat handwriting, dates, notes, plans, everything. But what froze them all, what made Pierre's mouth go dry, were the final entries. PD pending. MD pending. Pierre and Marguerite DeVoe, they were next. Solomon was arrested that night. But as Cartwright gripped his arm, Solomon leaned just slightly forward and whispered, "The poison is already in the house. You'll never find it." Pierre felt something collapse inside him. They tore the DeVoe mansion apart, as though dismantling it plank by plank might reveal salvation. For 3 days, constables, servants, and hired men scoured every corner from the kitchen spice drawers to the crevices of the wine cellar, from sugar jars to the tin compartments where medicines were stored. Every jar was uncorked, every bottle sniffed, every powder tested with crude, unreliable methods. They found nothing, no hint of arsenic, no foxglove residue, no aconite, nothing that would ease the terror Pierre and Marguerite felt each time they sat before a meal. Pierre refused to eat anything prepared inside his own house. He had trays delivered from hotels. Marguerite ate little at all, pushing food around her plate with trembling hands. Every sound made her flinch. Every cough felt like an omen. Every headache like the first symptom of something planted long ago. Solomon had already won, Pierre realized. Even locked behind iron bars, even stripped of freedom he had never truly possessed. Solomon held the house in a vice of invisible dread. When the trial began on June 30th, 1848, the courthouse swelled with bodies. Carriages lined the street. Ladies fanned themselves in the heat, their gloves damp with excitement and fear. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, whispering behind mustaches, their eyes sharp with morbid curiosity. People wanted answers. They wanted to understand how a man they had dismissed as less than human had orchestrated death among them. They wanted to see the monster. They wanted to be reassured he existed outside themselves. Solomon was brought in chains, but walked with the composure of a man entering a church he'd been inside many times before. His expression did not change as he scanned the crowd. His gaze lingered on no one long enough to acknowledge connection. It was as if he saw not individuals, but the whole of mobile society as one single, trembling body. The prosecution laid out their case with theatrical precision. They displayed the jars of plants, held up the packets of powders, read aloud the ledger entries with their chillingly clinical notations. They called witnesses: Rachel, who spoke haltingly of Solomon's herbs; Marcus, who swallowed hard before admitting the scent of bitter almonds he'd smelled on Solomon's hands; Eliza, who recounted the predictions that had begun to feel like prophecies only after the bodies fell; and Jacob, Laurent's servant, who told the court about the strange taste in the coffee. Each testimony tightened the noose. The defense attorney, Philip Hastings Young, pale, clearly overmatched, argued that nothing directly tied Solomon to the deaths. No one had seen him poison food. No tests had proven toxins present. Coincidence, he said, could look like design when fear sharpened the eye. But on the trial's third day, Solomon asked to speak. There was no tremor in his voice as he sat on the witness stand, chains clinking softly. His posture was perfect, his calm unnerving. When the prosecutor asked if he had written the ledger, he answered, yes. When asked what the entries meant, he said, exactly what they appear to mean. A ripple shivered through the gallery. Even the judge shifted in his seat. Solomon spoke in a measured tone, each word polished, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed them for years. I observed each person, studied their habits, their weaknesses, their cruelties. I applied knowledge where it was needed. Some called it illness. Some called it misfortune. But I simply removed people who made this world harsher than it needed to be. He listed them without emotion: Chamberlain, whose brutality toward enslaved laborers was well known; Catherine Apprentice, whom he said he released from suffering; Robert Apprentice, whose cruelty, he stated plainly, warranted intervention; Wickham, who grew too close to truth and would have destroyed the work. Gasps rose like a tide. Ladies pressed hands to their mouths. Men whispered, outraged, yet fascinated. And the child? The prosecutor demanded, his voice cracking. For the first time, Solomon hesitated. A faint shadow passed across his features. That was a mistake, he admitted quietly. An imprecise dosage. I regret it. The silence that followed was not relief, not sympathy only, a deeper horror, because remorse that appeared selectively was more terrifying than none at all. Then came the question the whole room leaned toward. Did you poison the Duval family? Solomon's expression softened into something resembling amusement, not joy, not cruelty, but a subtle, knowing smile. "Does it matter?" he said. A murmur swelled. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Solomon continued, his voice calm and clear. "Poison does not need to kill to do its work. Sometimes fear is enough. You will never eat without tasting dread. You will never drink without wondering if something is stirring inside you. That is a kind of death you cannot diagnose." The room held its breath. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. The jury did not deliberate long. Not an hour passed before they returned with the verdict. Guilty on all counts, Solomon was sentenced to hang in 2 weeks' time. The morning of July 28th dawned heavy with humidity. The sky smeared in pale orange light. Nearly 300 people gathered in the courtyard behind the courthouse. Some came thirsty for justice, some for closure, some simply because they wanted to see the end of the most unsettling chapter in Mobile's recent memory. Solomon climbed the gallows steps with unhurried calm. He refused last rites, refused a final meal, refused to bow his head when the sheriff asked for his last words. Solomon looked at the crowd, at the men who had owned him, at the women who had never seen him except as a shadow in their periphery, at the enslaved people who watched from the segregated section with expressions too complex to name. "You built a world where men are owned," he said evenly, "and you are surprised when ownership turns on you. Others will come, not tomorrow, not next year, but one day, because you cannot chain the mind, only the body." The trapdoor opened. His neck snapped clean, but the fear he planted remained. The rope silenced Solomon, but it did nothing to quiet the fear he had sown. In the days that followed, Mobile moved as if its very streets had absorbed a tremor. Doors that once stood open at all hours were now bolted. Kitchens, once entrusted to enslaved cooks and house servants without a thought, became guarded spaces. Food tasters, an absurdity the month before, became fashionable appointments in wealthy homes. Men who had prided themselves on rationality now found themselves examining every cup, every meal, every pinch of seasoning with suspicion. Pierre and Marguerite Duval lived in a state of permanent dread. Even when Solomon was dead, even when his body lay in the ground with a marker no one bothered to chisel his name into, the couple could not shake the sense that something unseen lingered in their house. Marguerite flinched each time she felt a pang in her stomach, convinced it was the first sign of poison long planted. Pierre stopped trusting water from his own well. They both avoided the kitchen entirely. Within 2 years, unable to endure the nightly terror of supper, the DVOAs abandoned the grand house on Key Street. They sold it at a loss to a family from Mississippi who knew nothing of its history. Even then, the DVOs did not find peace. Pierre died in 1856 after an illness that baffled every doctor who examined him, organs weakening in slow succession. No fever, no infection, only a quiet decay. Some said grief had eaten him from the inside. Others whispered that maybe Solomon had not needed to poison the man at all. The thought alone had done the work for him. Marguerite lived longer, well into the 1870s, but her mind withered in a prison of fear she could never escape. She moved from state to state, convinced that no matter how far she traveled, something Solomon left behind might one day catch up to her. Doctors said her ailments were nervous conditions, female weaknesses, melancholy. None dared suggest what she herself whispered only in fevered moments. What if it was already in me? Years before we found the ledger, the enslaved people who had lived beside Solomon fared little better. Their testimony spared them suspicion, but not danger. Within months of the trial, Rachel was sold to a household in Montgomery, Marcus to a plantation near Selma, Eliza to Mobile's outskirts. The Devo estate fragmented their lives as casually as one might rearrange furniture. In none of these new places did they speak of Solomon, but among themselves, Sock's dusty roads, whispered through cracks in cabin walls. Exchanged at night, Marcus's name traveled, not as villain, not as hero, not as monster, as warning, a reminder of what could grow in the dark. When a human mind was caged long enough, Sheriff Cartwright, troubled by the loose ends of the case, ordered for bodies exhumed in hopes of proving definitively what Solomon had done. But the tests available were crude. Arsenic dissolves its evidence if enough time has passed. Foxglove leaves no trace a 19th century doctor could detect. 2 bodies showed signs consistent with poison, but the findings were too uncertain to convict anyone, least of all a dead man. Thus the question, had Solomon actually poisoned all 10, remained suspended like dust in a beam of light, impossible to grasp. The ledger, when placed into the courthouse archives, drew scholars from other towns. They came expecting the deranged scribblings of a madman, and instead found cold precision. Calculations, marginalia, written in a refined, educated hand, notes that read like the observations of a scientist studying an ecosystem from within its darkest crevices. It forced Mobile to confront something it had tried never to consider, that intelligence does not heed chains, that cruelty creates consequences, that treating humans as furniture invites the possibility that one day the furniture might move. In Reconstruction, when interviewers collected stories from formerly enslaved people, Solomon's name surfaced occasionally, usually spoken with caution. Elderly witnesses described him with contradictions, brilliant and cold, dangerous and disciplined. They said his rage had been fermenting for years, that every word he overheard, every cruelty he witnessed, every humiliation he endured, had seeped into him until it became an quiet, unstoppable thing. Some said he had gone mad. Some said the world had driven him to clarity. No one could decide which thought was more frightening. Historians later re-examined the deaths, piecing together letters, diaries, medical notes. Their findings were unsettling. Nearly every person Solomon targeted had a documented history of brutality, corruption, or the sort of arrogance that blooms when power is unchecked. Some had beaten slaves. Others had stolen, cheated, or buried secrets in their ledgers and their gardens. Solomon, they realized, had not chosen at random, but the question of the DeVoe family lingered, like smoke. Were they truly intended to die, or was it simply his final stroke of psychological vengeance? The truth never surfaced. Some believed Solomon's smile on the stand meant he had planted something in their home. Others believed he had merely planted fear and that fear had done the rest. The house on Key Street changed hands 3 times in the next decade. Each family stayed for fewer years than the last. There were stories, the scent of bitter almonds drifting inexplicably through the pantry, headaches that came and went, faint scratching noises in the walls. One owner's daughter claimed she saw a thin man in the kitchen one night, watching her with a calm expression before disappearing into the dark. The stories were dismissed as superstition, but no family ever stayed. Today, the courthouse still stands, its brickwork faded, its windows reflecting the slow churn of history. The ledger sits behind glass, its ink darkened with age, but still crisp enough to read. Visitors lean close, drawn to the chilling clarity of Solomon's handwriting. Some say they feel a presence in the room, not malignant, but unnervingly observant, as though someone is standing just behind them, studying their pulse, the tremor in their breath, the hidden shadows behind their faces, because in the end, Solomon's legacy was not the bodies he left behind. It was the fact that he moved unnoticed among the powerful, not through magic or prophecy, but through the blind spot they had built around themselves. They never saw him because they chose not to, and he used that invisibility with a precision that would echo long after his body swung silent. His final words, spoken from the gallows, were retold for generations, not because they condemned the world that killed him, but because they warned it. You cannot chain the mind. Mobile learned that truth the hardest way. A city can learn anything through the quiet, methodical vengeance of a man who should have been invisible and chose not to be. The rest what he truly felt, what he truly planned, what he had never written in his ledger died with him. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of his story. It ends where fear begins, in the empty space where answers should be.